The Subcommittee on Energy and Environment will come to order. Good afternoon. I'm going to first apologize for a late start, but we just got off the floor with our first series of votes today, and I want to thank you all for your patience. Welcome to today's hearing entitled EPA's Impact on Jobs and Energy Affordability, Understanding the Real Costs and Benefits of Environmental Regulations. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosure for today's panel witnesses. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's hearing on EPA's impact on jobs and energy affordability, and to thank our witnesses for lending this subcommittee their time and expertise. At the outset, I want to note that, unfortunately, due to a personality conflict, I understand we should congratulate Cass Sunstein on the birth of a child. Administrator Sunstein from the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs will not be testifying today. I certainly understand his explanation, although it was not communicated to the subcommittee until late last week. I'm concerned and somewhat disappointed in the lack of transparency and responsiveness demonstrated by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs when trying to organize this hearing. Staff reached out to identify a mutually agreeable hearing date over 2 months ago, and beginning on April 24th, I sent formal invitations expressing flexibility regarding the office's appearance that remained unanswered. I'd be greatly disappointed if Administrator Sunstein refused to testify at some point before the subcommittee, especially in light of the fact that his predecessors have testified before the Science Committee and its subcommittee nearly a dozen times. An unwillingness to discuss recent regulatory developments would be especially disconcerting, given that Mr. Sunstein is responsible for overseeing the Open Government Initiative for the President's self-proclaimed, quote, most transparent administration in history, end quote. Further, his office is charged with enforcing the executive order requiring that the regulatory system be, again, quote, based on the best available science, as well as OMB standards on information quality, peer review, and data access. These are all issues directly relevant to the subcommittee's jurisdiction and work, and I expect the administrator to communicate to the subcommittee by the end of this week when it would be convenient for him to testify in the coming months. While OIRA is not represented to discuss this process of integrating scientific and economics assessments into regulatory decision-making, there are numerous executive orders and OMB and agency guidelines for thorough regulatory analysis. Unfortunately, many of these guidelines have been willfully ignored in order to pursue an unprecedented regulatory agenda that is at odds with the President's rhetoric about an all-of-the-above energy policy. Our witnesses today will describe a pattern of scientific and economic practices at EPA and OIRA that inflates health-based regulatory benefits, overlooks actual economic, energy affordability, and jobs impacts, and fails to reflect uncertainty in communicating risks. All too often, major EPA regulations have been underpinned by secret science, hidden data, and black box models. As demonstrated in the hydraulic fracturing cases in Pavilion, Wyoming, Parker County, Texas, and Dimmock, Pennsylvania, the agency often appears more concerned with crucifying press releases and enforcement actions than meaningful peer review or scientific analysis. Additionally, EPA has failed to account for the health impacts of the higher energy prices and joblessness that these regulations guarantee. More and more of these regulations are almost exclusively justified on the basis of incidental co-benefits from particulate matter reductions, raising the specter of double counting, and private benefits on the assumption that all regulated entities are acting irrationally and against their economic self-interest, and that the EPA knows what's best for their bottom line. The absurdity of these estimates is demonstrated in OIRA's 2012 draft report to Congress, which indicates that, based on benefits estimates generated by EPA, the agency's air quality regulations represent almost 80% of the benefits for all federal rules. Despite President Obama's executive order requiring that regulatory benefits justify costs, EPA recently announced its carbon pollution standard for new power plants and claimed that the rule, quote, will result in negligible CO2 emission changes, energy impacts, quantified benefits, costs, and economic impacts. As a matter of principle, regulatory benefits should justify their costs, and EPA's pursuit of this coal-killing regulation, despite its own admission that the rule has negligible benefits, is mind-boggling. As several of our witnesses will testify, this statement strains credulity, and the proposal is a de facto ban on new clean, coal-generated electricity in this country, as well as directly at odds with the President's all-of-the-above energy rhetoric. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today, and I look forward to a constructive discussion. I yield back the balance of my time, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Harris. I also want to begin by congratulating OIRA Administrator Cass Sunstein on the birth of a daughter last week. The human gestation period is somewhat predictable, and I suspect that Mr. Sunstein has known for some time that his wife would give birth about when she did. And that explains some of his reluctance to agree to a date to testify from among the options that the majority offered him. It's hard for me to imagine. He may not have mentioned that as the reason until last week, but it's hard for me to imagine he was keeping his wife's pregnancy secret. Pregnancy, particularly in the later stages, tends to be a fairly transparent event. But today's hearing is one he probably would not mind missing. This committee certainly should inquire into the cost-benefit analysis of environmental regulations. I've been concerned about economic cost-benefit analysis for a long time. Placing a dollar value on human life in deciding the economic benefit of environmental regulations raises serious questions, both practical and moral. Should we really value the lives of older Americans less than younger Americans, as at least one of our witnesses today apparently favors? And in a letter to Administrator Sunstein last fall, Chairman Harris asked, in spite of the fact that most mortality associated with particulate matter happens in the population over 65 years of age, EPA puts the same value on mortality for all ages. In your view, is this practice appropriate? The Bush administration briefly considered a senior death discount to justify weakening environmental regulations by valuing the lives of Americans older than 70 at 37% less than the lives of other Americans. Their analysis reduced the economic benefit of one air pollution regulation from $77 billion to $8 billion. The Bush administration recognized that they were swimming in deep waters, however, and dropped the idea of a senior death discount in economic cost-benefit analysis. That seems like the right decision to me. We know that it's a practical matter. If we forbid anything that could result in someone's death, then all economic activity will grind to a halt. But putting a dollar value on lives and valuing the lives of some more than others raises profound moral questions. I admit that deep philosophical discussions make me feel like I'm back in college. I'm in a dorm room late at night. 3 or 4 of us have had a few beers. We're sure that we're considering issues that have gone largely unexamined by previous generations and that our insights are wise beyond our years. But it's certainly better to talk about these questions out loud and let the American people in on the discussion. They might not agree that old folks' lives should be discounted. In fact, they might decide that Congress is really just more interested in pleasing special interest than in protecting the health of our mothers and fathers. And any supposed philosophical justification or economic justification for what Congress is doing is phony. If that was what this hearing was about, or even a discussion of economic cost-benefit analysis that was a notch or two less abstract or philosophical, the majority would have invited EPA to provide a witness to explain how they do cost-benefit analysis. The EPA that does cost-benefit analysis of environmental regulations, not OIRA. Instead, this hearing is one more forum for big, specific industries to air their grievances about the EPA. We've heard again and again for the last year and a half that the EPA is filled with authoritarian zealots bent on destroying jobs, raising energy costs, and otherwise making us all eat granola, wear sandals, and ride bicycles. We've heard repeatedly that the EPA knows little of scientific methods and even less of economic analysis, often from witnesses with few apparent credentials as scientists or economists. Given the disjointed nature of the list of particular grievances with the EPA aired today, the minority decided not to call a witness to today's hearing. If this committee holds a hearing in the future, for a serious, focused discussion of cost-benefit analysis, the communities affected by environmental exposures, and the practical and moral judgments that are behind the value of statistical life. We will certainly invite a witness. For today, I'm submitting for the record letters and reports by groups and experts with the experience and knowledge to contribute to a thoughtful discussion of cost-benefit analysis. I yield back. And Mr. Chairman, I believe that you have been provided already, or your staff has been provided already, a list of the letters, the documents that we submit for the record.
Yes. The Chair appreciates the request, but I have to reserve the right to object to inclusion of the items in the record at this time, as our staff simply has not had the time to adequately review the contents of the documents for relevance and appropriateness. As you know, we received, or may not know, we received most of the materials at 11:30 last night. And, you know, Congress, we like to think, is a 24/7 body, but 11:30 last night's a little late. We received additional materials at 10 o'clock this morning. You know that we've been in session since then, and they total 18 documents and 140 pages. And, you know, we read fast, but we don't read that fast. So it's quite possible that most, if not all, of these items will not present a problem, but we simply need additional time for review. The Chair would remind and encourage all members wishing to submit extensive materials into the record to share those in as far in advance as possible to allow for reasonable review time so that we can you know, get them in the record under unanimous consent, but I'm afraid that won't be possible at this time.
And Mr. Chairman, given that, first of all, I would like to have a chance to discuss these issues if you determine on any basis that these should not be part of the record. I do not recall any time that the minority has submitted documents for the record and had that request denied, but I would reserve the right to object to any documents that the majority wishes to enter into the record.
Sure, and if we sent something over 11:30 last night, I think you'd be totally appropriate for you to, especially 140 pages at 11:30 at night. It'd be totally appropriate for that to be a fact. Let me just, since you mentioned a letter that I had written to Mr. Sunstein, I would look forward to discussing the issues about statistical lives, maybe with Minister Sunstein, maybe Ezekiel Emanuel also. Because the whole purpose of the letter was that, in fact, Mr. Sunstein has said that we should use statistical life years and has repeatedly called for conducting regulatory analysis. I actually asked, is it appropriate in an EPA study? So I agree with you that that's something that we should discuss in a very open forum. Now, at this time, if there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce three of our witnesses, and I will yield to Mrs. Bigger to introduce Mr. Wolf and Mr. Trupek. The first witness is Dr. Michael Honeycutt, the Chief Toxicologist for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Welcome back. He's been employed by the TCEQ since 1996 and has managed the division of 14 toxicologists since 2003. His responsibilities include overseeing health effects reviews of air permit applications, overseeing the review of the results of ambient air monitoring projects, and overseeing the reviews of human health risk assessments for hazardous waste sites. Our next witness is Mr. Eugene Trisco, attorney at law, who's testifying on behalf of the American Coalition for Clean Coal Electricity. For 10 years, Mr. Trisco served as an expert witness on water utility cost of capital before the Public Utility Commissions of Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. In 2000 and again in 2007, Mr. Trisco was appointed by the U.S. Department of State to represent U.S. industry and labor in bilateral negotiations with Canada on air pollution control. Our fourth witness today will be Mr. David Hudgens, the Director of Member and External Relations at the Old Dominion Electric Cooperative. Old Dominion is a generation and transmission cooperative that supplies the electricity needs of 12-member electric distribution cooperatives that serve over 500,000 customers in Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland, and I might add the 1st Congressional District of Maryland as well. In his position, Mr. Hudgens works with these member cooperatives and local, regional, and state governmental agencies to identify and attract businesses to locate in the predominantly rural areas served by these cooperatives. I now yield to Mrs. Bigger to introduce our third witness, Mr. Tom Wolf, and our fifth and final witness, Mr. Richard Trupek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon to introduce both of these witnesses from my home state of Illinois. Mr. Wolf is the Executive Director of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce's Energy Council, where he advocates for the development of across-the-board energy sources. Prior to joining the Chamber, Mr. Wolf spent more than 20 years as a public affairs executive and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Mr. Trupak has worked in the environmental industry for 3 decades, starting as a stack tester and now acting as an environmental consultant to many businesses. He is the author of Air Quality, Permitting, and Compliance Manual and Regulators Gone Wild. I haven't read that one yet, but how the EPA is ruining Americans' industry, and holds a bachelor's degree from Loyola University in Chicago. So I thank both of you for joining us and providing your insights into these troubling EPA regulations. Look forward to hearing your testimony. Kneel back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Biggert. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize Dr. Michael Honeycutt to present his testimony.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Dr. Michael Honeycutt, Director of the Toxicology Division at the TCEQ. I have submitted more detailed written comments on the science behind EPA's cost-benefit analysis, but I'll touch on a couple of highlights right now. The EPA's cost-benefit analysis is detailed in the regulatory impact analysis for each significant rule. A number of executive orders address the requirement for and the goals of cost-benefit analysis. Under the Reagan administration, the benefits for a proposed rule had to outweigh the cost for that rule. However, the Clinton administration, the language was changed substantially such that the benefits must simply justify the cost. That position is maintained in the current administration, along with consideration for additional factors such as equity, fairness, promotion of economic growth, and job creation. The vast majority of the benefits that EPA calculates come from the so-called co-benefits of reducing fine particulate matter, or PM, even on rules that do not directly target PM. Those estimated benefits rely heavily on 2 key assumptions. Number 1, that PM causes mortality, and that number 2, that there is no safe level of exposure to PM. The most recent analysis of the cost and benefits of the Clean Air Act concludes that for every $1 society spends complying with these regulations, $30 in benefits is obtained. However, a more objective assessments of the human health benefits from clean air do not necessarily support the conclusion that the benefits outweigh the costs. Keeping that in mind, I want to briefly talk about the ecological epidemiology studies that EPA is using as the primary basis for the PM benefits. These studies are exploratory studies designed to look for correlations. They are supposed to be followed up by more rigorous epidemiology and clinical studies to determine whether the correlations are real. These studies are not supposed to be used quantitatively, and they are certainly not rigorous enough to set environmental policy. The assumption is that breathing PM made individuals die sooner than they would have otherwise. This type of study is notorious for unresolved issues. Were the individuals actually outside? Did they take their medications that day? Do they have other risk factors with a stronger influence on life expectancy, like smoking, cholesterol levels, or obesity? There are a whole host of common sense questions that go unanswered in these studies. Simply put, these studies cannot tell us if PM caused these deaths, or even if these people died prematurely, much less tell us what PM might have caused their death. Since 2009, the EPA assumed that there is a linear relationship between PM exposure and mortality. And you can see on the overhead here data from a typical study showing that the relationship between mortality risk and PM levels is not obvious. That's not a straight line, I'm sorry. In fact, one would be hard-pressed to detect a linear association. Nevertheless, statisticians can run data through elegant models to try to find statistically significant correlations, but the output of those models is only as good as the input, and as any scientist will tell you, statistical correlation alone does not imply causation. EPA also assumes that any exposure to PM, no matter how low, directly causes premature death. This method extrapolates risk far below the NAAQS, extending to background levels. This approach is not entirely accurate, nor is it conclusively supported by the data. In fact, ecological epidemiology studies are not designed to detect thresholds. Furthermore, this assumption does not take into account the fact that the body can handle small doses of PM, and indeed this concept is the cornerstone of toxicology. When the scientific data addressing the association between PM and premature death is examined in detail, it becomes obvious that these statistical associations may have very little biological significance. The increased chance of dying that is reported due to PM exposure is extremely small. This chance is communicated by what is known as relative risk, with the relative risk of 1 being non-significant. Scientific as well as legal guidance indicates that relative risk below 2 should not be considered to support this relationship. The relative risks for PM and premature death reported to date are considerably lower than 2. For the 2 studies EPA uses, one relative risk is 1.06 and the other is 1.16. And some of the studies show no relationship, and in fact, some studies suggest that PM can make you live longer. These issues illustrate EPA's modus operandi. The concept of weight of evidence is misused to discount contradictory data. They use worst-case assumptions, fail to put risk into proper perspective, and fail to disclose how uncertain the data are. Our agency believes that regulations are an integral and necessary tool to protect public health and our natural resources. Likewise, our expectation is that those regulations be based on sound science, be justifiable, and that they realize true benefits. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Eugene Trisco for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Miller. I'm Eugene Trisco. I'm here on behalf of the American Coalition for Clean Coal Electricity. And I have conducted for the better part of the last decade an annual study as a consultant to ACE entitled Energy Cost Impacts on American Families. This study really started soon after the Kyoto Protocol, when a question arose, what are American families spending on energy? Because there were a variety of estimates at that time when the Kyoto Protocol was being considered in the United States, a number of studies that suggested impacts on the order of $500 or $1,000 per household or more. So we wanted to try to get a handle on a baseline. What are Americans spending now for energy? So having done this study pretty much on an annual basis since 2000, we've created, if you will, a baseline that has allowed us to track changes in energy costs. The report analyzes consumer energy costs since the year 2001 for all U.S. households and examines the pattern of energy expenditures among 4 income levels and for senior and minority families. It relies on historical energy consumption survey data and current energy price forecasts from the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration. By way of a footnote, EIA is just now beginning to release the results of its 2009 survey of residential energy consumption, and it has not yet got to the point where it's releasing consumption or expenditure data. When we get that information, we will update the study accordingly. But based upon the preliminary results from the 2009 survey, it appears that the consumption data, if anything, may be somewhat higher than they were in the previous study in 2005. Slightly more than 1/2 of U.S. households have average pre-tax annual incomes below $50,000. Mr. Chairman, this country is divided precisely in half at an annual household income pre-tax of $50,000. Our median family income today is $49,455, and that has not changed in principle in the 10 years in which I have been conducting this study, with no adjustment for inflation. In 2001, families with gross annual incomes below $50,000 spent an average of 12% of their average after-tax income of $21,800 on residential and transportation energy, gasoline. In 2012, these households are projected to spend 21% of their average after-tax income of $22,390 on energy. Family incomes have not kept pace with the rising cost of energy. The U.S. Census Bureau reports that since 2000, real inflation-adjusted median household income has declined by 6% and is 7% below the median household income peak of $53,000 that occurred in the year 1999. Higher gasoline prices account for nearly 4/5 of the increased cost of energy for consumers since 2001. In nominal dollars, average U.S. household expenditures for gasoline will grow by 136% from 2001 to 2012, based on EIA gasoline price projections for 2012. Electricity has maintained relatively lower annual average price increases compared to residential natural gas and gasoline. Electricity prices have increased by 51% in nominal dollars since 1990, well below the 72% rate of inflation in the Consumer Price Index. The nominal prices of residential natural gas and gasoline have nearly doubled and tripled, respectively, over this period. Virtually all of the residential electricity price increases over the past 2 decades have occurred since 2000. These increases are due in part to additional capital, operating, and maintenance costs associated with meeting clean air and other environmental standards. Lower-income families, including millions of fixed-income seniors, are more vulnerable to energy costs than higher-income families because energy represents a larger portion of their household budgets. Energy is consuming 1/5 or more of the household incomes of lower and middle-income families, reducing the amount of income that can be spent on food, housing, health care, and other necessities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Wolf to present his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Tom Wolf. I'm the Executive Director of the Energy Council at the Illinois Chamber of Commerce. The Council is made up of companies that generate, transmit, transport energy, or supply the energy marketplace. Thank you for the opportunity to give a little bigger picture perspective on some of the regulations being proposed on future greenhouse gas emission from new sources. When it comes to the energy regulatory oversight, businesses are looking for a few general themes. Some of them include predictability. What can and should they plan for? A sweet spot where interests, including environmental interests, are protected and commerce can flourish. Benchmarks that are based on science and engineering, not wishful thinking. And diversity, allowing everyone a shot at success so we don't rely too much on one form of energy. We believe the new rulemaking on greenhouse gas emissions for new sources proposed by the U.S. EPA falls short of these goals. Here's a couple reasons why. The proposed rulemaking sets a limit which most natural gas generators can accommodate with today's technology, but that coal generation cannot. It seems a bit strange that this magic limit saves the planet and just so happens to allow natural gas but not coal generation. We understand there's a provision in the U.S. EPA regulations for coal companies to average the greenhouse gas emissions over 30 years, theoretically allowing them to build a new plant, retrofit it with sequestration technology when it becomes available, if and when it becomes available, and move forward. That path for new coal could move forward. But that path seems to run through the installation of carbon capture and sequestration, a technology that is still under development and too expensive for use today. We hope that changes, but it's unclear that it will. Given that, what company will be able to get financing for a new plant that is built on the hope that a new technology will be available and affordable at some point in the future? We don't believe investors would or could take that risk. Let's take a moment to remember how much cleaner coal generation has become in the past 3 decades. The Prairie State Generation Plant in Marissa, Illinois, outside St. Louis, on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River, produces 50% less regulated emissions and 15% less greenhouse gas emissions using the best available control technology, a great step forward. However, we believe if these proposed regulations take hold, the leap coal producers are asked to make in greenhouse gas emissions will be a roadblock to innovation, not an incentive. The leap being asked for could result in companies abandoning coal research and moving to other forms of energy, leaving us more vulnerable with fewer energy supply choices. We believe if these regulations are enacted, the cleaner coal technologies will be invented somewhere else, or they won't be invented at all because other countries that rely on coal are making little to no effort to minimize greenhouse gas emissions. We are a leader in cleaner coal technologies today and could be going forward. I hesitate to try and quantify the exact costs of the proposed rulemaking that I'm going through. If I've learned one thing in my 4 years in this position, is the future is really hard to predict. Who could have predicted that the new natural gas finds we found in our country that could turn us into a natural gas exporter versus an importing one we thought we would be? Who could have predicted that crude oil from North Dakota, which was 7,500 barrels a day in 2006, is now over 500,000 barrels a day? Who could have predicted that wind turbines would be 30% more efficient than they were 3 years ago, or solar equipment costs have plummeted the way they have? But unless there's a leap in coal generation technology that is unforeseen at this time, we believe the rules proposed by the U.S. EPA on new sources will effectively shut down the future of new coal generation and the jobs, economic development, and opportunity that would come with it. In closing, I want to talk about the Prairie State. I did a tour of Prairie State, talked to the lead environmental engineer there, and asked him what he felt about working at that plant and how he felt about working on the environmental controls. And he said, "I'm a kid in a candy store. Every potential environmental control is in this plant, and I'm so proud of working here. We need to make regulations that inspire him to roll up his sleeves and find the next innovation that makes coal even cleaner, instead of rulemaking that I believe makes him want to throw up his hands and go, 'Are you kidding me? We can't do it.'" So we suggest taking a long, deep breath, take a hard look at these new regulations, and change them to allow new coal plants to be built, incentivized in a way that creates a market for the technological advances that will make coal cleaner and cleaner and a viable option for U.S. and global electricity users. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. David Hudgens for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Good afternoon. My name is David Hudgens. I'm the Director of Member and External Relations at Old Dominion Electric Cooperative. ODEC is a generation and transmission cooperative headquartered in Glen Allen, Virginia, which is outside of Richmond. We provide electric power to 11 member distribution cooperatives in Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. Among our portfolio of fossil fuel generation, we have a 50% ownership in an 850 megawatt coal-fired plant in Halifax County, Virginia, and 2 simple cycle combustion turbines in Virginia, and 50% of another one in Maryland. As an owner of existing fossil fuel generation, and more importantly, as we continue our interest and efforts to develop a coal-fired base facility, Cypress Creek Power Station, ODEC's decisions on future generation will be directly and negatively impacted by the adoption of the new source performance standards for carbon dioxide. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak today on the EPA proposal, or as I learned over the weekend, the Employment Prevention Agency, i.e. this plant will employ 3,000 construction workers for 4 years, 225 permanent jobs at the end of the construction, and does not include any ripple effect of hundreds of millions of dollars that's going to ripple through the economy. So it has a material impact on the entire region about these rules. But today I'm here to state officially that ODEC has significant concerns related to the proposal. This rule, the NSPS, is at its core flawed. EPA fails to provide a stated projects and benefits for this rule. The proposed rule standard is set without regard to fuel type, with only certain natural gas-fired units capable of meeting the proposed limit without control equipment. Given that there is currently no commercial available demonstrated technology capable of removing the required CO2, namely carbon capture and storage from large coal power plant, the standard mandates fuel choice in lieu of technologies. The NSPS was never intended to be used to redefine a source or dictate use of one fuel over another. NSPS must be technologically driven and not enacted to drive an overall national mitigation goal. Additionally, the EPA, in the efforts to justify the standard, rely on 2 major assumptions. First, EPA believes that implementation of a currently unachievable CO2 standard for coal will drive commercial development of the emerging carbon capture technology to ensure future compliance. Second, the proposed rule presumes supply of natural gas that will be affordable and readily available to fuel the significant increase of baseload generation in the coming decades. ODEC believes both of these assumptions are erroneous. With regard to carbon capture technology, EPA states in the release of the proposed standard, today's proposal does not interfere with construction of new coal-fired capacity. EPA is just on the standards providing a 30-year averaging and assume that full-scale carbon capture technology will be commercially viable within 10 years, given current and projected government testing and demonstration. This averaging requirement alone will preclude any new coal plants from being built. No company will take the risk to invest billions of dollars into a power plant in the hopes that carbon capture technology will be developed. Additionally, financial lending institutions will not lend money to construct a plant without a viable technology to demonstrate compliance. This is a $5 billion investment on behalf of the cooperatives to provide 1,500 megawatts. There are some demonstration projects involving enhanced oil recovery. However, this administration's interagency task force on carbon capture noted only when the financial, economic, technological, legal, and institutional barriers are addressed will carbon capture be a viable mitigation option, unquote. Finding suitable storage areas, developing pipeline infrastructure, and developing large-scale capture technology, in addition to the legal and liability issues, are significant, if not insurmountable, hurdles to overcome. ODAC has been and continues to be a member of the Southeast Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnership. We recognize the need for these partnerships to facilitate exploration and expansion of this nation's technological capabilities. As a Virginia cooperative, coal has been an abundant, consistent, and economical source of fuel for development of baseload electricity for many decades. While we have seen recent prices of natural gas at all-time low, EPA's assumption that prices remain low is extremely short-sighted. Historically, the U.S. government has consistently failed to accurately predict future natural gas prices, and world market implications of natural gas pricing are disturbing. Electrical affordability from natural gas generation is significantly driven by the fuel price. EPA's proposed standard will effectively eliminate ODAC's choice for affordable baseload electric power. ODAC recognizes that solutions to this country's power needs in the future will take resources and innovation. However, this proposed mandate will not drive those solutions because of the significant impact it will have on the electrical generation industry as a whole, and more importantly, on ODAC's ability to construct new baseload generation that will be affordable for all our owners. ODAC urges the committee to fully and objectively examine the source material in this proposed rule. Also, we urge the committee to encourage the EPA to withdraw this proposed rule. This concludes my testimony, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak on this fundamental issue of powering the United States economy into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize our final witness, Mr. Richard Trupek, for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Miller, for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm Rich Trupek, a chemist and environmental consultant, currently employed as principal consultant with Trinity Consultants, Inc. I work in the trenches, as it were, for the small and mid-sized companies that do not have their own environmental staff. You have my written testimony, so I'd like to use this time to highlight a few points. First, the perception in the regulated community that the EPA is overly aggressive and overly intrusive is real and, in my opinion, justified. When former Region 6 Administrator Dr. L. Armendariz made his famous crucifixion speech, it came as no surprise to those who work on the industrial side. From the industrial point of view, he honestly expressed, albeit in far too colorful language, the way that most high-ranking EPA officials view enforcement actions. My experience has been that, at the federal level, intimidation is often as important as compliance. Second, many parts of the regulatory structure and the federal permit system are needlessly cumbersome and complex. Some states do what they can to provide help in streamlining. TCEQ is a great example. But there is little they can do about the parts of the programs which are subject to U.S. EPA oversight and approval. The complexity of the regulatory structure creates more and more opportunities for noncompliance, which has nothing to do with exceeding emission limits, but are rather strictly about paperwork and procedures. The combination of aggressive enforcement, regulatory complexity, and a clunky federal permit system does lead to adverse economic consequences. I have seen many cases in my career where the decision not to build a facility in the United States or the decision not to expand an existing facility was heavily influenced by the regulatory environment. This is not to say that environmental regulations were the only factor in these decisions, but they were important factors. Third, I believe it is time for Congress to review the way the U.S. EPA is allowed to continually redefine its mission, particularly with respect to the Clean Air Act. Under the Clean Air Act, the U.S. EPA is allowed to continually redefine what constitutes clean air by issuing new ambient air quality standards. By continually moving the goalposts farther and farther as the air has gotten remarkably cleaner and cleaner, the agency thus justifies a continuing level of effort with less and less actual environmental or human health returns. The United States now has some of the cleanest air in the world, and I would respectfully suggest that it's time we acknowledge that fact and that the Clean Air Act reflects that fact. Fourth, the economic justifications that the U.S. EPA uses when promulgating new regulations are, in my opinion, seriously flawed. In my opinion, US EPA both grossly overestimates the economic benefits of regulations and ignores many economic, societal, and health consequences on the other side of the ledger. In a way, I think it's unfortunate that we call the metric value of statistical life because it tends to imply maybe I can plop down $9 million and buy a person. What it really is the net economic productivity of the average person, how much money he makes, how much he impacts the economy. When you say it's a value of a life, it's going to be insulting no matter the number. I personally think I'm worth more than $9 million over the course of my life. And there's no way that metric should be used or should be called what it is, as though it was a real value of a life. It's a value of what a person does and earns in his life. You'll note that all the above comments are not related to the US EPA under this or any other administration. These comments would have applied 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago, etc. The only real difference over time is that we can apply the word more each and every year. Regulations get more complex, the EPA gets more aggressive, economic justifications are more unbelievable, etc. There's one thing that is unique to the EPA under the current administration, and that's what I refer to as the regulatory tsunami, aimed squarely at the use of coal in power and industrial sectors. Through a combination of greenhouse gas limitations, which the previous witnesses have talked about, new permitting requirements, new ambient air quality standards, and new hazardous air pollution rules, the agency has made it virtually impossible to build the new modern coal-fired generation in the United States that would replace our aging fleet. The EPA has thus effectively decided that more and more of the baseload power generation capacity the American depends on will be natural gas-fired. In the long term, I strongly suspect this will lead to substantial increases in the cost of electricity and in more wildly fluctuating power prices. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and please feel free to call me again in the future if I can be of assistance to the committee.
Thank you very much. I thank the witnesses for being available for questioning today, reminding members that committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair at this point will open the round of question, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Trupek, let me just follow up on that regulatory tsunami. I'm sure you're aware, as everyone in the public is, we had this 2,700-page Affordable Care Act bill, and a whole bunch of rules and regulations had to come from it. Are you aware that there are twice as many regulations from the EPA as there are from Health and Human Services before OIRA right now, despite the fact that HHS has to implement a 2,700-page health bill that involves 17% of the U.S. economy? Twice as many. Would that surprise you?
That frightens me.
It wouldn't surprise you. I didn't think it would. With regards to this statistical life, that's kind of related to the quality-adjusted life, which is, if I recall, Ezekiel Emanuel, the advisor to the president, is the one that introduced that concept in regards to how to ration medical care as we go to look to decrease the costs of Medicare in the future. Am I correct? I mean, it's the same concept that, in fact, older lives somehow don't get the same amount of resources as younger lives.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right. That was Ezekiel Emanuel's whole point of his pretty famous paper. Now, Dr. Honeycutt, let me ask some questions. I'm going to ask you, can we show the slides here? Because I'm going to show this. These are some of your slides here that you didn't present, but they're in the written testimony. Now, the first one suggests, because, in science we like to think we kind of, seek the truth. Apparently the truth before pre-2009 appeared to be that maybe 4% of all deaths was due to PM 2.5, but the truth somehow changed post-2009, and all of a sudden 4 times as many deaths. One of those science is wrong, right? I mean, we have to assume that no cataclysmic event occurred in 2009, except maybe the beginning of a new administration, that would have quadrupled the number of deaths attributable to PM 2.5. That's kind of correct?
Yes.
Right? Okay, now let's go to the next slide, which I think is one that you showed. When I took my master's degree at the School of Public Health, the first thing they taught us in the statistics course is before you do any statistics, you actually look at the data. Now, I look at this data, and if you took that line that's vertical, which really is nothing, that's just, that point 15, and you looked at that data, and I asked someone to draw the best line, to imagine that a line describes this data, or even a curve describes this data, one would look at it and go, well, you really can't. Because with those outliers there on the right, you could say, well, I could draw a line going downward. With those outliers on the left, well, maybe it's straight across. So the first validation of any statistical analysis is look at it and say, should you subject to statistical analysis? I got to tell you, I look at this, I say, I'm not sure I would. Let's go to the next slide. And that's true, right? That's the way you're supposed to deal with statistics?
You're absolutely correct.
This is the assumption of causality. Now, this is the most worrisome because what you're suggesting, and I wish, Cass Sunstein were here, and God bless him on the birth of a daughter. I have 2 daughters. He's going to have his hands full, and 3 boys. He's going to have his hands full for a while. But the research was an association.
Absolutely.
Which they teach you in epidemiology should never be attributed to causality until you do actual studies that prove causality. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now this is the assumption of causality, and even if you assume causality, this is where you say most of the studies, because that line above the number 1 assumes that there is no effect. Most of those studies fall on that line, and only 1 study, if I look at it, doesn't have an estimate, a range of estimate, of accuracy of estimate that actually doesn't touch the line 1.
Yes, sir. It's very...
So the assumption looking at that data would be there's actually no evidence that there is a increase in relative risk.
There's very little.
In fact, the studies you say that indicate there's a 1.06, I imagine that study actually included 1 as part of the range.
Actually, it didn't. It was very close to 1.
Well, you said there were 2 studies, 1.06 and 1.16, but I don't see 2 that don't touch the line of 1.
Yeah,
maybe it's the 1.16 that did it. That's what I thought. And the next slide. This one is very interesting because it assumes that if you want to live a longer life in Dallas and in Houston, you better start breathing some PM 2.5.
Yes, sir.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Because you can use the same association and the same causality information to say that actually your risk is decreased in Dallas and Houston and Birmingham, and no, Las Vegas crosses the 1, and actually there are only a very few cities where there's even a slight increase. Maybe in Phoenix and Milwaukee it might not be hazardous, but that could outweigh Dallas. And as far as you know, does the EPA, did they change the requirements for Dallas and Houston based on this scientific data?
No, sir. We have the same requirements everyone else.
You do, even though the evidence is that in Texas it appears to be protective.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's kind of what I thought. Anyway, thank you very much. We'll get a second round. I'm sure I'll get some more in. And I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Miller, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That set of questions makes it all the more remarkable that no one from EPA was invited to appear at this hearing, because these analyses are done by EPA. They are not done by OIRA. It certainly would have been useful to have had someone here from EPA to ask some of those very particular questions that the Chairman was just asking. The reason that I set out verbatim in my opening statement the Chairman's question to Cass Sunstein last fall is I did not want to summarize the position he was taking, since it was, as I say, in jeopardy in the form of a question. But let me put this innocent, although it pretty clearly is implicit in the question. For purposes of this question, if your position is that EPA should value life not by life but by years, and that if an environmental exposure lessens life by a percentage and therefore it's more years for younger people, then if that's your analysis, then you are saying yes, younger people's lives should count for more than older people's lives. Given that assumption, Mr. Honeycutt, could you answer this question? In spite of the fact that most mortality associated with particulate matter happens in the population over 65 years of age, EPA puts the same value on mortality for all ages. In your view, is this practice appropriate?
No, sir.
That is not appropriate?
No, sir.
Okay, you do believe that younger lives should count for more than older lives. There should be a senior discount.
Actually, the lives should be the same. It's the life years that needs to be different, because actually the rules impact people mainly 80 and over.
So you were
it adds months to their lives. So a 25-year-old, if he lives past 25 years old, if this were infant mortality, you would be correct. You would use a whole life, but we're talking adding lives to people who are over 80. Or adding years, months to the lives of people who are over 80.
Okay, so you're again, the gist, however the analysis that you get there is that the life of a younger person should count for more than the life of an older person.
Well, they should count equally, because a 25-year-old, his value of a statistical life, it should be the same no matter what. But an 80-year-old who dies 4 months sooner than they would have, they've only lost that 4 months.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Honeycutt. Mr. Honeycutt, there's a pretty clearly established legal concept that there can be many causes, but if they act in concert, that each one is a cause. Do you dispute that in any way? I mean, if someone is obese and a smoker and is exposed to particulate matter or any other kind of environmental exposure, and that combination had not existed, they would have survived, then each one of those is a cause.
Each one can contribute. The question is, how much do they contribute? And I think the answer is those other factors contribute a lot more than PM does, if PM does at all.
Okay. I understand the whole idea of double counting is that that two different rules may accomplish the same purpose, and if you count it the same for both, you're double counting. But it's certainly possible to have discrete benefits from two different rules, and it's possible to have a cumulative effect from two different rules. Your slides suggest that there's been double counting, but there's absolutely you cite no authority for that at all. What is your authority for the EPA double counting the benefits of air pollution controls, for instance?
Well, I mean, it's taken directly from EPA analysis, because when you reduce, if a rule reduces PM by a microgram per cubic meter, and another one does, it's reducing the same microgram per cubic meter.
Why is it not 2 micrograms per cubic meter?
Because it looks at... How
do you know it's the same microgram?
Because you're measuring. If you're measuring at a monitor, see, these aren't looking at sources. They're looking at monitors in the environment, monitors at a city. So if it's reduced at a monitor somewhere, it doesn't really matter where it came from. It's reduced at the monitor. That's the difference between an ambient standard and a point source standard.
Right. But you've offered no authority. Is there any authority? Is there any published paper that shows that they are actually double counting rather than there being discrete benefit or a cumulative benefit?
I'm not sure about a published paper on that, but you can actually just look at EPA's data and pull that information out. It's there, and I'd be happy to show you that. Okay.
Well, I mean, even better would be to have an EPA witness come and have that person ask those questions. My time has almost expired, and I will yield back the last 15 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're actually 15 in the red, but we'll give you. Remember, we're going to have another 5 minutes, and you know, gosh, I kind of wish that the minority had invaded the EPA. I'd love to hear their explanation. Ms. Biggert is recognized, the gentlelady from Illinois, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wolf, you recently testified at a public hearing in Chicago on EPA's proposed carbon pollution standard. Do you think that based upon recent EPA behavior, the agency is likely to incorporate and respond to your concerns in the final standard?
I hate to predict the future of what government agencies do. I certainly hope that they'll take a look at this. The industry, you know, I represent a lot of different voices in the industry in Illinois, wind, solar, coal, nuclear, crude oil, utilities. It's not like they're against every regulation in the book. They would like regulations that they believe allow a sweet spot for them, environmental protection and a successful business model. And I'm hoping the US EPA looks at this specific one and has a path for coal that really is a path for coal and not a roadblock.
Okay. Then do you think that the recent EPA regulatory activity is consistent with the all of the above energy policy?
I think this proposal is not consistent with that. I think this proposal does preclude new coal generation from happening. The coal producers and actually some of the other producers of energy I've talked to about these regulations, people aren't even in the coal business. Some of the wind people I talked to look at this and say, yeah, they're not going to be able to build with this. It's just too much of a leap. Where they say incentivization for maybe permitting incentivization, so every new permit is X% cleaner for greenhouse gas, gives that an incentive as an idea to get better and better and cleaner over time. If you just say, here's this big bar you have to reach, and they can't reach it, they're not even going to try to get there.
I know that in Illinois there was sequestration that was talked about for a long time in southern Illinois, which has not happened, but it seems like there's been some breakthrough on the greenhouse gases for coal. I thought that they really had, in some of the plants, had been able to remove that from there.
Well, on the sequestration side, there's actually a pilot project going on in Decatur right now where
Yeah.
they're sequestering 1 million metric tons over 3 years, and we're hopeful that pilot project will prove successful both technologically and environmentally and economically. But again, we're not sure.
So it is moving forward.
It is moving forward. But there's a lot of ifs in that scenario, and to put out regulation that says every if is going to work out, therefore let's do it this way, is grasping. And then, I think the coal industry has shown over the past 3 decades that it can get better. They're not sitting on their hands and saying, we're done, this is it, this is the best we can do. Consistently, they are showing they can get cleaner and cleaner in their energy production, and we should give them that chance to continue that.
Okay. Then, Mr. Chupak, what are the cumulative effects of these various EPA rules on the bottom line for small businesses?
For small businesses, they have a very market effect on the bottom line. In the small entrepreneurial businesses that I deal with, the person who is trying to manage the EPA program is usually the driving force in that industry, in that business. He's the entrepreneur. And the more time he has to spend doing things that really don't have environmental benefit, or just about paperwork and procedures, the less time he is being productive, the less time he has to devote to growing his business.
And do you think that the EPA's carbon pollution standard that will effectively ban coal generation will impact the manufacturers and small businesses?
I think in the long term, because coal has been for years the great stabilizer in energy prices, and natural gas, as I think Mr. Hudgens pointed out, historically fluctuates a lot, and if you don't have certainty on energy prices, that's definitely going to affect my clientele.
Okay. And Mr. Trisco, what impact will the recently proposed and finalized rules on the power sector have on coal mining and coal miners?
Thank you, Mr. Wolf.
Mr. Trisco. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. The most recent economic impact analysis of the impact of the EPA Mercury and Air Toxic Standards Rule, sponsored by ACE, is prepared by National Economic Research Associates. I can briefly summarize those job results because your hearing is focused in part upon the impact of these rules on jobs. Now, this is not broken down for coal mining jobs. Coal mining jobs obviously are kind of first in line. They're the first to be lost in this process, followed by losses in the utility sector, the railroad sector, and so forth. There are, of course, some offsetting job gains in construction of pollution controls and the like. The nearest study of the MATS rule, and this was dated March 1st, 2012, so it's prepared after the final rule was promulgated. And it's focused only on the MATS rule and compares that rule relative to 2 baselines. First, a CARE baseline, the Clean Air Interstate rule, which is in effect today, pending the court's stay of CASPR, and then second, a baseline of the CASPR rule, assuming that is implemented at some point. And in sum, the estimate of the net job impacts for the 2 rules are a net loss of 215,000 permanent full-time equivalent jobs for the MATS rule plus CASPR relative to a CARE baseline. So it's a net loss, 215,000 permanent jobs.
Right.
When you compare the MATS rule relative to the CASPR transport rule, the estimate is for a net loss of 180,000 permanent full-time jobs. ACE would like permission to submit this study for the record following the conclusion of this hearing, because all of the assumptions underlying the findings I've just summarized are contained therein.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that the study be submitted for the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. The gentlelady yields back her time. We have enough time for a second round of questioning, and I'll begin a second round of 5 minutes of questions. If we can show show the slides, you can put them up, and this slide right here. I finally found that other box that didn't intersect with 0, because they're so close to the line of 1, you can't see it. The two studies with the lines are the Layden study from 2006, the Pope study from 2002, which actually form the basis of $1.8 trillion of the $2 trillion benefit claimed by EPA, the economic benefit. Now, my reading of that slide shows that both those overlap the relative risk of 1. Is that true?
Well, sir,
Are they just really, really darn close?
They're very close.
Okay, and just put in perspective, is it true that smoking increases, the relative risk with smoking is about 2.8 times?
Yes, sir.
So you're looking at maybe 2-3% increase versus a 280% increase, 180% increase.
Yes, sir.
In those, okay. And that's 1.8 trillion of the 2 trillion. That's how really you get to 30 to 1. Yes. Do you know if meta-analysis has been conducted on those to actually increase the power of it to see if when you put all those studies together they intersect, that they overlap 1?
Yes, sir. A lot of meta-analysis have been done. The problem is one of those studies has over 1 million people in it.
I got you. So it weighs. You're right. It overweighs in the meta-analysis. I understand that. Look. I'm sorry that the EPA isn't here to testify, but to be honest with you, we've been waiting since September. We were promised by personally, Gina McCarthy promised me to send that data that justifies that from those two studies and the data. And Mr. Holden appeared, and Mr. Smith asked him. He promised he would send it. We've been waiting for 7 or 8 months. I understand the EPA is busy writing regulations and doing other things, but they should have some time to respond to Congress when we ask those kind of questions. Now, Mr. Hudgens, Cypress Creek Power Station, that base facility you're talking about that would help provide electricity into my district for Chop Tank Electric. You stated that your decisions on the base load facility obviously will be directly and negatively impacted by the new carbon pollution standard for power plants, despite the agency's claim that there is zero cost associated with the rule. We're going to have Lisa Jackson, if she appears, testifying in this room at the end of the month, and she's claimed that this rule won't kill coal due to flexibilities included and the ability to incorporate carbon capture and sequestration in 10 years. My assumption from your testimony is that you don't really agree that that's necessarily true. Obviously, you probably would have gone ahead and built the facility.
Mr. Chairman, at the end of the day, this whole process of billions of dollars is driven by the financial institutions that we deal with on Wall Street. And one thing that bankers do not want is uncertainty.
Right. I should add, it's actually the financiers who really don't trust that that's a stable, financially sound decision to
take a risk, a $5 billion risk.
Right. On the fact that, for instance, the carbon, and we know because we've had testimony in front of this committee, that carbon capture and sequestration, the demonstration projects actually haven't been done. They're just not scalable. They're really not financially feasible, and yet we still hear that that's true. The prediction of energy costs, because I guess Lisa Jackson bases that on a $250 a million BTU cost of natural gas, but the EIA estimate, you have to trust the EIA at some point. Are you aware of what their estimate was for this year's cost of natural gas 2 years ago?
I am not.
So it's $450. It's actually $250. The government's only off by a factor of 80% in that estimate. Do you have any reason to believe that the government will be able to predict, or that Ms. Jackson is able to predict, the cost of natural gas? And is that in fact part of the basis for the decision to say that coal really might be, the price stability of coal might be the most dependable way to go if these rules weren't in place?
Mr. Chairman, sometimes we've got to use common sense, and anytime you have a
this is Washington D.C. I beg to differ. This is.
Understand, but at the end of the day, it's about monopoly, and if we're forced as a utility into the gas market as to be sole supplier of gas, of electricity through gas, then what is going to happen to a price in any monopoly? And we can point throughout history of when the monopoly occurs, prices rise. And
Sure.
what we're fearful of, 3-4 years ago, gas was at almost $14 a MCF.
You're absolutely right, and we have a long history of the stability of coal prices. Mr. Trisco, can you add to that?
Yes, Dr. Harris, given your penchant for statistical analysis, I think you would be interested to find that the EIA's analysis of the NYMEX future natural gas contract that appears on the Short-Term Energy Outlook webpage for DOE contains a tab called Probability Analysis. And if you click that tab on probability, you will find the 95% confidence intervals for the NYMEX December 2013 natural gas contract. It gives the reference case projection and then the 95% confidence intervals around that projection. Now, that is a contract price that is some 18 months hence. And EIA's 95% confidence interval is between a range of slightly less than $2 per million BTU and slightly less than $8 per million BTU.
Only a fourfold range.
Yeah.
Easy to predict, I guess. Listen, thank you very much, and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Miller, for a second round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Among the 17 documents that I earlier asked be included in the record and did not yet have a ruling on, almost all of them are letters from groups that have an opinion, have a point of view on this topic. I have never known an organization that has a point of view on a topic that is before a congressional committee being denied the right to have their views included in the record. Some clippings, articles in various publications, and only a couple of at all detailed technical kinds of documents, one of which is summary of expert opinions on the existence of a threshold and the concentration response function for PM-related mortality, technical support document. This is published by the EPA. It was compiled by the EPA. It includes several participants, some of which I've heard of, like the American Heart Association, some of which I've not heard of, but the list of authors of their papers is long, and their credentials appears impressive, and in every case, they have an equally long and equally impressive list of peer reviewers. It's pretty stunning to me to think that the majority staff does not know about this, did not know about this document well before last night in preparing for this hearing, because this seems to be a pretty basic document. Mr. Honeycutt, are you familiar with this document?
I'm familiar with most of the statements in it.
Well, are you familiar with the list of scientists who participated in one way or another, either as authors or as, well, some list authors and peer reviewers, some list experts, but this list of scientists who participated in preparation of this document?
Yes, sir.
You are familiar with that list, okay. Well, you've criticized the EPA, including in your testimony today, as being secretive, not telling you what their analysis is. This seems pretty open.
Well, actually, the data underlying their analysis is not available.
Was that data provided to this list of, it looks like probably a couple of hundred scientists?
No, it wasn't. That data is held by a couple of universities, and only the university professors have access to the data.
I'm sorry, the data is not provided to peer reviewers?
That's correct. Only the analysis of the data is.
The people who, the scientists who agree to be peer reviewers are not seeing the data upon which they're...
You're absolutely correct.
Well, I'm not correct. I'm not saying it. I'm asking you.
Your statement is correct.
Okay. That's what you're saying. All right. And so you disagree with the statement by the EPA that studies demonstrate an association between premature mortality and fine particulate pollution at the lowest levels, measured in the relevant studies, levels that are significantly below the NAAQS's NAAQS for fine particulate fine particles. These studies have not observed a level at which premature mortality effects do not occur. You say that is not supported by data or by scientific analysis.
Oh, no, sir. That's absolutely true. But there are other studies that don't show that association, and there are other studies that show that PM is, if you can interpret it this way, helpful. And I think that's the problem. EPA doesn't present that data. They only present the positive data. They don't present the negative data.
Okay. One of the advantages of having peer reviewers is presumably that they know the literature of the field. Do you believe that this what appears to me, to my lay in my lay opinion, to be an impressive set of experts? Do you think they do not know the data in this area, or the analysis, the literature in this area?
Well, actually, a number of those people, that is their data. So I would expect them to advocate the use of their own data over another researcher's data. But
the other studies that you refer to, you're saying that what they're referring to is just some studies, and then they're contradictory studies. When they say that the studies demonstrate an association between premature mortality and fine particle pollution at the lowest levels, measured in the relevant studies, that what they're saying is our studies, but there are other studies that contradict that.
That's true.
And that these couple of hundred scientists did not know about those studies, or did they know about those studies?
They may have. I'm not sure what they did or didn't know. But those studies are older studies. Those studies, the exposures occurred during the 80s and 90s. A lot of the newer data shows different effects, or doesn't show the effect.
Okay. My time has expired.
Steel mills.
Thank you very much. And seeing no other members here, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony, the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for you, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing if we do. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. Again, I want to thank you very much for your patience in a late start to the hearing because of our voting schedule. The witnesses are excused. Thank you all for coming. The hearing is now adjourned.